This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our department's web address for future reference. So if you feel like you want to review any of the information that is presented, you can feel free and go to our website, and we'll be right there for you so you can go ahead and review it. The department utilizes these webinars to allow the community, current and future students, to get a glimpse of what our faculty members are working on within NSU, and the opportunity to ask questions about our programs and the faculty members' work at the end of the presentation. Dr. Jonathan Banks is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at NSU's College of Psychology. His research focuses on working memory, mind wandering, and attentional control. Specifically, he is interested in the role of working memory to control mind wandering and the impact of mind wandering on current task performance. His research also examines the impact of acute and chronic stress on cognitive function and is examining mechanisms responsible for stress-related working memory and executive functioning impairments. With that, let me introduce our speaker today, Jonathan Banks, PhD, and his presentation on mindfulness, mental armor.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I hope you've had a nice day, and you're looking forward to hearing a little bit about the work that I have been doing for the past maybe 15 years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing overall, looking at the impact of stress on cognitive functioning and attentional control, but also really focus on some of the work I've been doing with my grad students here at NSU, looking at mindfulness meditation and how that may be helpful to us. So let me get started. So if I can, there we go. Okay, hopefully you're now seeing my the first slide. Looking at mindfulness meditation really is mental armor. And I'll tell you a little bit about exactly what I mean by mindfulness meditation as we go along, because there's a lot that really gets kind of lumped under a larger umbrella of mindfulness that may not really count in terms of what we're talking about in terms of mindfulness meditation. So when you think about mindfulness meditation, I'm betting there are lots of things that may jump into your head. So when I talk about mindfulness meditation, especially to undergrads or even people in the community, the first thing they think of are people in these two pictures, right? They think about mindfulness meditation and they think about hippies, or they think about Buddhist monks. And when they start thinking about mindfulness in this way, they really may be thinking, this isn't for me. I'm not a hippie. I'm not a Buddhist monk. How can mindfulness really help me? I'm not one of these two groups. And what I want to talk to you about today is really that mindfulness is not just for hippies. Mindfulness is not just for Buddhist monks. You don't have to meditate 8 hours a day in order to find some of these beneficial effects that we'll talk about today. And really it is something that we can all do, something that does take work, does take practice, and we'll talk about how some of the largest benefits are really seen when people are practicing regularly, just like when people exercise regularly. But it's not something that you have to do for an hour a day in order to find benefits. And I know thinking about spending an hour a day of your time doing anything may be hard. If you're anything like me, you're juggling work, you're juggling family, you're thinking about school, maybe trying to do something to have some fun, to relax, and the time in the day becomes very short and very crunched. But I think what a lot of people find with mindfulness is that if they can find just 15 minutes, 10 minutes to devote to that practice, then all of a sudden some of the stressors that they usually deal with in life may not seem quite as stressful. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we can take away your stressors. I wish we could. If there's something we could do to reduce stress in your life, that would be great. But maybe we can reduce the impact of that stress. So let's start by talking about what mindfulness is. And this is a really critical component as we start thinking about exactly what mindfulness is and how it operates. It's important to distinguish the type of mindfulness that I'm talking about from other types that you might find in the field. So specifically what we're interested in when we're talking about mindfulness here is we're talking about improving awareness through increases in focused attention and through open monitoring of sensations without reactivity to those sensations or thoughts. Now, that's an older definition from Davidson and Goleman, but let's kind of break that down a little bit. So we're thinking about the first part, right? Improved awareness. That's just meaning improved awareness of what's going on in your environment, right? Improved awareness. And that's through two pieces, right? Through focused attention, being able to focus your attention when you want to, and through open monitoring of sensations, right? Knowing what's going on around you, even if you're trying to concentrate, knowing when you've drifted off, but without reacting to it. Now, with that definition, we have two kind of main pieces of this sort of meditation. The first is a focused attention meditation. With focused attention meditation, we're really focused on sustaining selective attention on a very specific object. So what you may think of when you think about some of these focused attention meditations, if you've listened to any meditations, or maybe you might have a meditation app or something like that, those have become very popular, is some of these meditations focus on your breath. That's an easy thing to focus on because we all are breathing, right? And so we can very easily focus our attention on our breath, focus on it coming in, focus on it going out, focus on physical sensations in our body. Sometimes we can focus on an object or something of that nature, right? So these focused attention meditations are attempting to strengthen selective attention to that specific object, improving our ability to focus our attention. And you'd think that's probably a really good thing just in everyday life. Obviously, it matters in the classroom, it matters as you're maybe working on a task at work, but it matters in the real world, right? So hopefully while we're driving, an important thing, as we're driving, we should be focused on one thing. We should be focused on driving, right? Focused on the road, focused on things that we might see. So our ability to really focus on the road, focus on things of that nature is really important. And you should hopefully ignore distractor information. So as we work on this focused attention meditation, we're really working on improving our ability to maintain our focus on one thing, whether it's paying attention in class or whether it's driving down the road. The second type of meditation that goes with this kind of is you can think of it as a second step. It's an open monitoring meditation. With this open monitoring meditation, it's the second half of that Davidson and Goleman definition. It's remaining attentive to moment by moment to anything that occurs without focusing on a specific object, right? So here what we're trying to do is maybe just remain aware of our thoughts, aware of our feelings, but don't get caught by any one of them, right? So maybe you're sitting there, you think about having lunch, and you're sitting outside eating your lunch, and as you're eating your lunch, there's a lot going on around you, right? You see people walking by, you may hear traffic, hear noise, people talking on the phone. And what this really is, what this open monitoring meditation really strengthens, is your ability to be aware of those thoughts without really focusing on any specific object, and going further, without reacting to them. So without reacting either positively or negatively to sensations or thoughts. So maybe while you're meditating, you realize that your back is very uncomfortable. It's being aware of that without really focusing on it and reacting to it maybe in a negative way. Overall, what both of these are doing, what both focused attention meditation and open monitoring meditation are doing, is really trying to train attention, right? And attention is a really important cognitive function, whether we're talking about it as we measure it in the lab, and I'll talk to you about that in a little bit, or in a class. If you're sitting in class, it's really helpful to be able to focus on the instructor. So right now, I'm hoping that everyone is able to focus on what we're talking about in this presentation. Right? And the better you are at focusing your attention, there are lots of really good benefits in the real world that can be helpful to us. Okay, so when we're thinking about attention, one of the types of ideas that we use is thinking about attention as a spotlight, right? We have this nice spotlight and we're focusing our attention on that spotlight, but what that also means is that we're not focusing our attention on things outside of that spotlight. Right? You should be focusing your attention on the item in that spotlight, whatever that thought, that task, that goal is, and really ignoring everything else. But the problem is, now, I'm sure this won't happen during this presentation, right? You're not going to drift off and think about other things. You're going to remain focused on exactly what we're talking about, but occasionally, I know in other people's presentations maybe, you tend to drift off and something captures your attention. right? Something says, hey, look over here, pay attention to me. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, rather than paying attention to what you were supposed to be focused on, you've drifted off, right? You've drifted off. You're now thinking about what you're having for dinner tonight. You're thinking about a list of tasks you have to do. You're thinking about anything except what you're supposed to be focused on. Now, what we're going to call those, any of those off-task thoughts, we're going to give them a name. The overall name that we're going to call them is mind wandering. But we're going to call them something specific. We're going to call them task unrelated thoughts, or TUTS. These task unrelated thoughts, or TUTS, well, they pop up that when our attention gets pulled away from what we want to focus on. Okay, so I had been talking a little to you about mindfulness, but the reason I really got into mindfulness research has to do with the work that I was doing as a grad student during my PhD program, and I've continued doing here at Nova Southeastern University for the last 8 years or so. So my real interest is looking at stress, all right? Looking at stress, looking at how individuals respond to stress, how stress impairs cognitive functioning. So I don't know if this picture really hits home with anyone. I know this picture hit home with me when I first saw it as a grad student, right? As grad students, you spend lots of time working on papers, lots of deadlines, and sometimes you need that coffee, that espresso, to go straight into the vein because you can't drink it fast enough to stay awake and keep moving, right? That's a stressful event in your life. And we all experience stressors, not just grad students, not just faculty. We all experience stressors, right? Stressors that make us want to pull our hair out. We think about all these thoughts, right? So we think about savings, we think about money, fear, not getting enough sleep. We think about our health, headaches, bills, jobs, right? All of these things stress us out, even when sometimes they're going well, right? Work can be very stressful. If it's just after 5 now, right? You may just be getting off work. Even if you had a good day at work, like I did today, it was maybe still a stressful day, right? Lots of deadlines, lots of things to do, very busy. And so we can all relate to what that stress is like. Now, we even see this happening with children, right? So even kids experience these stressors in their life, whether it's stressors with school, stressors with family. I've been told parents can sometimes be stressful, and just other activities they have going on. So why do I care about stress, right? I care about stress because when we think about psychological stress, we see that psychological stress tends to harm a lot of important cognitive functions. And I differentiate between psychological and physiological stress because psychological stress is really what I've been looking at mostly. And with psychological stress, we're dealing with things like daily hassles, negative life events, so death of a loved one, maybe getting into a fight, some sort of traumatic event occurring, or even daily hassles, right? Daily hassles that we all go through. If you guys live in South Florida, you know that traffic might be an extremely strong stressor, especially if you have a longer commute or if you are frequently making that and there's an accident like there was this morning on my way in. All of those things can be stressful. That's a little different than physical stress. With physical stress, we're dealing with something where we're actually physiologically stressing them out, either by asking people to put their hand in a bucket of ice water for 3 minutes or delivering an electric shock or something like that. So with psychological stress, we see impairments in a lot of different important cognitive functions. Working memory, one we'll talk about a little bit. Working memory is responsible for maintaining your executive attention, helping you focus on something while at the same time being able to hold items in memory. We see impairments in decision making. We see impairments in problem solving. All of those are going to harm you just on a daily basis. We also see impairments in what we call everyday cognitive failures. And I like these everyday cognitive failures because they're things that we all experience, right? So everyday cognitive failures can be things like forgetting where you parked your car, forgetting where you put your keys, walking into a room and forgetting why you went in there. If you haven't experienced one of those today, my bet is by the end of the day, one of those, or maybe by the end of the next couple days, one of those will happen. especially around the holidays when you have a lot of stuff going on. Maybe you go to the mall and you do a lot of shopping and you're stressed and trying to make sure you have everything for everyone, and then you come out and you've completely forgotten where your car is. Again, those are relatively common things that people experience, but on days where individuals are experiencing more stress, you're more likely to have some of those everyday cognitive failures. So it seems that stress hurts these cognitive functions, but my question in grad school and my question now continues to be why? Why is it that when we have all this psychological stress that we end up having poor cognitive functioning? So one thing I want to look at when I talk about this, like I already told you, is what's called mind wandering, right? And I know we've all experienced this. Again, hopefully not in the last 20 minutes or so, but we all experience these task-unrelated thoughts. In fact, we end up mind wandering between about 30 and 50% of our daily life. So this isn't a rare activity. This is something we do quite frequently. Now, one problem with mind wandering, well, here. So maybe while you're at work, right? If you're at work and you're thinking, you're working on something, you're actually thinking about going to the beach, right? Or maybe you're daydreaming about becoming Iron Man. Or maybe you're simply sitting in class or sitting at work and you're just checked out and you're trying not to think about anything at all. Well, one problem with trying not to think about something is what's called the ironic rebound effect. A term coined by Wagner. The ironic rebound effect refers to this fact that when we try not to think about something, we may be successful in not thinking about it for a short period, but then we get this return of those thoughts, right? So when I ask people in my class or in a lab not to think about something like a white bear, right? They're okay at not thinking about that white bear for a short period of time, but pretty soon after that, they start thinking about a white bear, and they're no longer able to keep that thought at bay. Now, it's not probably a big problem if you're thinking about trying not to think about a white bear or trying not to think about becoming Iron Man, but it can be a bigger problem if maybe you're trying not to think about some negative life event. So for instance, if a girlfriend or boyfriend just broke up with you, a spouse broke up with you, and then you have to go to work, right? You're expected to perform well at work, but at the same time, all you're thinking about is that breakup. And maybe you're trying not to think about it, but as we try not to think about it, we tend to think about it more. Maybe that's what's going on with these task impairments, right? So we see that mind wandering is associated with performance impairments on a variety of tasks. We see that we see poor driving performance. And I know many people may have had the experience where you're driving down the road and you realize you're a couple miles further down the road than you thought you were. You may have missed your exit and you've got to go back because you've mentally tuned out. You're no longer thinking about the task you need to be thinking about, driving, but instead you're thinking about maybe what you're having for dinner or what you have to do that night or something that happened that day. Obviously, mind wandering can have very important consequences here, right? If we mind wander while we drive, the consequences can be lethal, right? We can kill ourselves, we can kill other individuals. We see impairments on maybe tasks where the consequences are lower, right? Sustained attention tasks in the research lab. Or reading comprehension.
No.
Or even
no, not yet.
Retention of material in class.
In here.
So some work by some colleagues,
probably...
also included, have shown that when individuals are asked if they're mind wandering in class, they do more poorly on class, they do more poorly on the exam.
Where did I put it?
Okay.
Get out.
So mind wandering is clearly I did with my PhD advisor, Adriel Bowles, and I were interested in looking at seeing if we can manipulate some of these life stressors. Now, obviously, in the lab, we can't cause you to have a negative life event. That would be completely unethical and really impossible. We can't make you break up with someone or make some negative life event occur. But what we can do is ask you to think about it. Think about something that's maybe happened in the past, or think about something that's happened or what you think could happen in the future. So for this study, we're interested in asking people to write about either a positive upcoming event, maybe a very negative upcoming event, or something neutral, depending on condition. We were interested in the effect of that on both mind wandering and on working memory. So participants wrote about these future events, We also were interested, and what I want to focus on today is we were interested on the role of daily stress, right? So those daily stressors that we talked about, traffic or exams or things of that nature, how do those impact working memory? Exactly how does it occur, right? And why is it occurring? And whether mind wandering is playing a part in that. Okay, so our hypothesis was that if we asked people to write about future negative but not positive or neutral events, we would see more mind wandering and we'd see poorer working memory performance, but also that TUTS would mediate the relationship between stress and working memory performance. And what I mean by that is that when people have more daily stressors, they would have more mind wandering, and that would be hurting working memory performance. So we had 150 participants from the University of North Texas, completed 2-session study. In session 1, what we'll focus on today, they completed 2 baseline measures of working memory capacity. It's the AO span and the R span task. Both of these tasks ask you to do some processing component. So the AO span asks you to do a math task, and then a storage component. It then gives you a letter you have to remember. So you get a math task and a letter, and a math task and a letter, and then you're asked to recall the letters. So you've got to do both at the same time, and no, you can't cheat and write it down. That would make it easy. Now, during these tasks, we interrupted people at random points in the task, and we asked them what they were just thinking about. So as you see here, it says we gave the AO span and R span with thought probes. So those are probes so we can measure what you were just thinking about right now. We also gave them a couple measures of self-report measures of stress. And then in session 2, they came back, they completed the writing tasks that I told you about, and again, we measured working memory. So what I want to focus on today really quickly for this is looking at what's going on in session 1. So I told you that we interrupted them with thought probes, right? That's how we want to know, are they mind wandering? So when we interrupted them with these thought probes, we asked them, what were you just thinking about right before you saw this on the screen? And then they chose between these options. Either they were on task, they were doing a good job staying focused on task, as I know you guys are. They were thinking about how well they're doing, maybe. Maybe they think they're doing really well, or they think they're doing really poorly. Or they're not thinking about the task at all. Maybe they're thinking about the task and something that's neutral. So they're thinking about what they have to do after the study's over. Or they're thinking about something that's off task but positive. They're thinking about the fact the semester's almost over, the holidays are here, trip to Disney, something of that nature. Or they're thinking about something that's off task and negative. So maybe they're thinking about an exam they failed, or they're thinking about a breakup of a relationship, or a death in the family, something of that nature. And then the last time in the second session, we also asked them if they were thinking about what the task that they wrote about. Okay. So what we have here is a mediation diagram, and I'll kind of walk you through it. What you see here is one of the measures of stress, right? The DICE, the daily inventory of stressful events. And what we see is that there is a relationship. As scores on the daily inventory of stressful events go up, people have more TUTS. And if you remember, those are task unrelated thoughts or evidence of mind wandering. So as you experience more stress, you have more mind wandering. That probably won't surprise you if you think about your daily life. On days that you're more stressed, as you're sitting at work or you're sitting in class, you may find yourself drifting off a little bit more. But what's important is that those TUTS, the rate of TUTS was also negatively related to working memory scores, right? So as we had more mind wandering, we had less, lower performance on the working memory task. So that's a really important finding that we're really able to address in the lab for the first time. That these daily stressful events, things that happened to students before they ever came in the lab, are now causing performance problems on tasks in the lab, and it's because they're thinking about those everyday life events, those things that occurred prior to coming in. Now, it kind of makes sense, but this was one of the first studies that really demonstrated that very direct link. So we know that stress is hurting working memory because people are mind wandering, or at least that's one mechanism involved. All right, so let's jump back to mindfulness, right? I care about mindfulness maybe because of what's going on with stress. So in thinking about mindfulness, I became interested in mindfulness because of one of my master students. One of my master students, a former master student, approached me and said she really wanted to do her master's thesis looking at mindfulness meditation. And I'll be honest, I didn't know as much about mindfulness at the time as I do now. And so I said, okay, but I need to see the scientific literature. Show me the literature that says it does something. And of course, she brought me stacks of papers and convinced me very quickly that this is something we clearly need to be doing, and I should have been doing all along. So I had two real questions as we started this. One was, when does mindfulness help? Right? Does mindfulness always help? Is it always beneficial for individuals? Or maybe is it more beneficial at some points? And then the second question was, how does it help, right? What is it actually doing? How is mindfulness meditation? And again, we're talking about this very specific definition of increased awareness through focused attention and monitoring of sensations without reactivity. And this really comes more from a mindfulness-based stress reduction framework than some of the others. There are a lot of different types of mindfulness meditation. Really, this is focused more on a mindfulness-based stress reduction technique. So two questions, right? One, when does mindfulness help? And two, how does it help? Two big questions. So let's maybe look at the literature, right? Some of the studies that my grad student brought me. The first really interesting study in college students, right? College students, this is work by Merzick and colleagues. College students completed a 2-week mindfulness training course. They came into the lab. They had a mindfulness trainer in the lab. They came in over this 2-week period multiple times to receive instruction on how to do mindfulness meditation. And the control group for this study was a group that was interested in that received a nutrition training program. And they had a number of measures they were interested in looking at. So they were looking at increases in verbal GRE, changes in working memory capacity. And what you can see in figure A and figure B is that in the mindfulness group, they increased verbal GRE from pre to post. They increased working memory capacity from pre to post. And the nutrition group did not see those same increases. So it seems like mindfulness is helping, at least helping in terms of GRE and working memory performance. It's kind of nice for those of you thinking about applying to grad programs that GRE is an important score. But also, what they see over here in C and D is they see reduction of mind wandering, right? And that's both in probe caught, like the probes I just showed you, where we stop them in a task and ask them, but it's also in self-reported mind wandering. So we see decreases there as a result of the mindfulness training that didn't occur as a result of the nutrition training. So some interesting evidence that there may be something going on here. Now, a colleague of mine at the University of Miami, Amishi Jha, has done a lot of work looking in very high stress groups, right? So she's looking in very high stress groups. She's specifically done a lot of work looking at pre-deployment U.S. military cohorts. This is a study from 2010 where she looked at pre-deployment U.S. Marines in an 8-week period prior to their deployment. Now, obviously, school can be stressful for college students. Work can be stressful, but that pre-deployment period for U.S. military is a much more stressful period, right? You don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, the consequences of doing poorly on an exam for a college student are going to be very different than the consequences of something going wrong for a military population. So much higher stress group here, right? And so for this group, they received an 8-week mindfulness training. Again, they had trainers come in. It was Dr. Jha calls it an MMFT, sorry, a mindfulness-based mental fitness training, and working with these pre-deployment Marines. And what you see in graph A over here is that in the individuals that received the training, who did a lot of practice, what was called the high practice group, they showed an increase in working memory scores. Now, remember, during stress, right, some of the work that I've done and others, when we experience stress, we see decreases in working memory performance, right? And that's what typically happens. And what we see over here with our military controls, these are individuals that did not receive the training and just had the stressful period. They see decreases in working memory capacity. That's really what we'd expect in the face of stress, that impairment in performance. But the high practice group, it wasn't just that they were preserved, they got better, right? Their working memory went up. Right? And so that's important. Now, the other critical piece is that this low practice group that we see here, they got worse. Now, that's a really interesting finding, that even when people practice mindfulness meditation, they may get worse if they're not doing it sufficiently. And that's what you see over here in figure B, right? So you have a plot of practice time and working memory score. And so as the more time you practice, as practice time goes up, your working memory score goes up. So this really does seem to indicate that, a lot like exercise, the amount of training you put in matters. Just like you wouldn't expect to be able to go run a marathon if you went out this weekend and did 2 1-mile runs. That probably wouldn't go well. You need to practice with mindfulness, okay, just like with exercise. Another study by Jaw's lab, this one, Rooks et al., looked at the similar effect, not in a military cohort, but in a cohort of football players. Right, so they looked at a 4-week mindfulness training group during a very high-stress preseason training camp. This preseason training camp's high stress for these players, because they're at that point auditioning for spots, right? If they do really well, they may be first string. If they do very poorly, they may be sitting on the bench and on the practice squad for the year. So this is a really important time for them. And what we see here are changes in sustained attention performance. So as we increase in practice time, we see increases in sustained attention performance, similar to what we saw with the working memory performance before. So it appears that the more you do it, the better it is for you. Now, I was interested in what happened in a college population, but maybe if we could find another way to deliver this intervention. So the work done by SROUR, my master's student, who really got me interested in mindfulness meditation research, really was interested in examining the impact of a brief training, right? The trainings I've talked to you about before are 8 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe some 2-week trainings. A lot of the MBSR trainings are 4 to 8 weeks. And so the real question was, what might we be able to deliver in a week? What's going to happen as a result of that? I've talked to others. We're kind of starting on the low end and we're working our way up on some of these interventions. So the other question that I had was, can these interventions be delivered at home? Right? If you're familiar with mindfulness at all, you may know that there are a lot of different apps out there, and people use these apps, and they're obviously not coming in for a trainer. They're doing it at home, they're doing it at work, they're doing it in places that it's convenient. We wanted to know, can we deliver this intervention at home? So we had participants come in to the lab. They took baseline measures of working memory and mind wandering. We then gave them a 15-minute mindfulness recording. Right, 15-minute mindfulness recording based on ones that have been used in prior literature. And we asked them to listen to this recording over the course of a week, for at least 4 times over the week. They listened to it once in the lab. They then came back a week later. They listened to it again just to remind them about focusing their attention and non-reactivity and things of that nature. And then we tested working memory. So we wanted to know, does working memory change pre and post this training? Now, one important piece methodologically is that we used a relaxation training group as our control group. One important piece that we see a lot in the mindfulness meditation literature is what's called a placebo effect, or a possibility of a placebo effect or an expectancy effect. Right? Especially when we are listening to this training that's talking about improving your attention. Well, if I give you an attention task in the lab, you may think that you should do better. And if you think you should do better, you might try to do better. So we'd hate to see any of these effects really being due to people trying harder or people expecting to be better. So what we try to do, and a lot of good researchers, a lot of my colleagues have been doing this as well in the mindfulness training literature, is really looking at what we call an active control group. For this, our active control group is relaxation training, because there are lots of reasons to believe that if you're more relaxed, you're going to do better on any of these tasks as well. Okay, so again, we measured working memory pre-post, and let me show you some of the results here. Actually, let me tell you really quickly first that we were expecting that in the mindfulness training condition, we would see improvements in working memory performance that we wouldn't see in the relaxation training. But we were also interested in one more thing. Remember, I told you that my colleague Dr. Jha is interested in looking at this really in high stress groups. We had an idea that maybe mindfulness training is most beneficial in the face of stress. Remember we said we had 2 questions, right? And our first question is, when does mindfulness training help? The second, why? So this study wanted to know, well, does it help in the face of stress? Or is it just something about training? So when people came into the lab the second time, they came into the lab the first time, they received the script, they did 2 working memory tasks, they came back, they completed the recording again, they listened to the mindfulness training, they took a working memory task, and then we stressed them out. We do that a lot in my lab. We stress participants out. And for this study, we stressed them out by asking them to write about a negative life event. Right, again, I said earlier, we can't cause people to have negative life events, but we can ask them to think about them. And typically when we ask people to think about negative life events, we see ratings of positive affect decrease, we see ratings of negative affect increase, and sometimes we see cortisol changes as well. So we stressed them out, and then we gave them another working memory task. So let me show you what that data looks like really quickly. So time 1 and time 2, those were in the first session when they first came into the lab, and what you see for both the blue and red groups, so the blue is the mindfulness meditation group, the red is the relaxation training, is really no change. Not all that shocking. They came into the lab, they took this working memory task, the AOSPAN, twice, and you see no change from time 1 to time 2. That's fine, that's what we'd expect. And we sent them home again, we sent them home with that recording, and so between time 2 and time 3 right here, they had 1 week at home listening to that training. Okay, and what we see is this increase here, but the increase really happened for both groups. There wasn't a statistically significant difference here with that mindfulness training group. It does look like they get a little bit better as a result of the training, but unfortunately it wasn't statistically different. But again, the important piece, so 1, the training helped maybe a little bit, but relaxation might have as well. The second and really critical piece is what happens after we stress them out. So we can see after we stress them out right here, between time 3 and time 4, all of a sudden we see a decrease in AOSPAN performance in our control group, our relaxation training group, and absolutely no change in our mindfulness training group. So the take-home message here is that even that 1 week of mindfulness training appeared to prevent the stress-related decrements in working memory capacity. Now that's really cool. They didn't go up, but they didn't go down, right? Those that got the mindfulness training seem to be protected. That's why I wanted to call this talk mental armor. Mindfulness is mental armor, right? It tends to protect these cognitive functions. And this decrease we see in the relaxation group is exactly what we see in relaxation group, or in control groups when we stress them out, right? When we stress people out, working memory performance goes down. Now, we were really excited. Alex SROUR was really excited that we find this effect, and it seems like we've done something right. So our next thought was, well, this has to be because of less mind wandering, right? If you remember, mind wandering hurts cognitive task performance. So our assumption was that the mindfulness meditation training group, well, the reason they did well is that they didn't mind wander more. The relaxation training, after we stress them out, they must mind wander a lot more. Does that make sense? All right, so let's look at that data, because remember, we prompted people as they were doing the task, as they were doing these working memory tasks, to tell me exactly what you're thinking about. And we did not find what we were expecting. This happens in research sometimes, right? So what we see from time 3 to time 4 is actually an increase in mind wandering for both groups. This was not what we expected. This was not our initial assumption that maybe we'd find this, right? So we stress people out and everyone mind wanders more, even if you've had mindfulness training. Now that's kind of counter to the literature I've showed you before, right? The Marzick 2-week study that showed decreased mind wandering. But remember that Marzick study was just looking at mind wandering in general. We're really caring about what happens in the face of stress. Okay, so far what we're seeing is that people their working memory performance is maintained, but yet they still mind wander. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. So our next study, our follow-up study to that, was really interested in looking at how mindfulness might be protective, because it does appear to be protective, but it doesn't stop mind wandering, at least in very short doses. So we were interested in looking at whether a very brief 15-minute mindfulness training, just one session in the lab, what would happen to one session in the lab? What would specifically happen to these negative off-task thoughts, right? The negative thoughts, not the other off-task thoughts. What would happen on a sustained attention task? Okay, we had 89 undergrads from Nova Southeastern University that completed either a mindfulness training, a relaxation training, or they did nothing. They actually got to sit and read a magazine for 15 minutes. Again, they completed a series of working memory tasks. They completed either the mindfulness training, the relaxation training, or nothing. We then had the exact same stress manipulation. We asked them to write about something negative, and then we gave them a sustained attention task. And our sustained attention tasks are loads of fun. I know you'd love to do them. We ask people to respond by pressing the space bar. Every time they see a number on the screen, the number is between 1 and 9, but they have to withhold a response every time they see a target number. In this case, it's usually the number 3. Now, that seems okay for a couple minutes, but this task usually lasts around 30 to 35 minutes, and you can see it probably gets kind of boring. All right, so here's what we found. We found no difference in any of the groups, surprisingly, on performance on the sustained attention task. But what was really interesting to us is that when we look at these different categories of mind wandering, and remember, our thought probes, we had asked them if they're off-task neutral, off-task positive, or off-task negative. And when we look at neutral rates of mind wandering right here, we see no difference between the groups. We look at positive rates of positive mind wandering, no difference between the groups. But when we look at rates of negative mind wandering, now all of a sudden we see a significant difference. We see that the mindfulness training group is showing the lowest rates of negative off-task thoughts. And that's important because of some other work in my lab that's really showing that all those the impairments that we've been seeing from mind wandering on task performance, so mind wandering and hurting working memory performance, hurting class performance, at least when we look at lab tasks, all of those impairments seem to be driven by negative off-task thoughts. So if you're sitting in class and you think about Disney or trip to Disney or the holidays or anything of that nature, you don't seem to be impaired as much. However, if you're sitting in class and you're thinking about your final, or you're sitting at work and you're thinking about applying to grad school and how stressful that can be, then maybe that does start hurting performance. So we wanted to look to see whether these rates of negative off-task thoughts were associated with performance. So do negative TUTS hurt? And what we see is that negative TUTS do hurt performance, but only for people in the relaxation and the control condition. That mindfulness training, even a 15-minute mindfulness training, does appear to be protective. Remember, we're talking about protective in the face of stress, right? So it appears to be protective against these impairments, okay? So a couple quick things. One, it seems that mindfulness does appear to help. It may be most helpful, right? When is it helpful? It may be most helpful when we experience stress. And again, I can't reduce the number of stressors in your life. It's kind of hard to reduce the number of stressors because you can't alter traffic or what other people do or your boss or your instructors or any of those things, but maybe we can change how we respond to it, right? And so it's possible that mindfulness, kind of why mindfulness helps, mindfulness may be helping in that it's doing something to these negative off-task thoughts. Remember when I talked initially about the kind of components of mindfulness meditation, right? And the first was that focused attention training. And the second was the open awareness, right? Being aware of your thoughts, being aware of thoughts and things going on around you, but without reactivity to them. That without reactivity is really important. Think about all the thoughts you might experience on a daily basis, or just as you're sitting here now, kind of like a train, right? And every thought is a train car that passes through. So as those train cars are passing through, it's okay to acknowledge that the train cars are passing through, but the focus is not to really let any one of them grab your attention. Don't let it grab your attention and derail what you should be focused on. Allow that thought to move through. And the data we have here from this mindfulness, this very brief mindfulness induction study, is showing that individuals, when we give them a very brief mindfulness induction, they experience maybe fewer negative off-task thoughts, but those off-task thoughts certainly seem to hurt performance a lot less. which is consistent with what I showed you with our first 1-week mindfulness training study. Now, just really quickly, I'm a cognitive psychologist, so all of my work is really looking at how mindfulness is affecting cognitive functions and looking at cognitive mechanisms. But the impacts of mindfulness meditation are not just cognitive. There's lots of impact on all sorts of health factors. I'm also interested in some of the neuroscience factors, right? What's going on in the brain? So we see changes, we see increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. That's an area that's involved in the working memory system. We see greater left side anterior activation, similar to what happens when we induce a positive affect. We also see increases in regional brain gray matter density. So we see changes in the left hippocampus, posterior cingulate cortex, temporal parietal junction, all areas associated with things like learning and memory, emotion regulation, perspective taking, and referential processing. All really important functions when dealing with stress and stressful events. Okay. So a lot going on, not just at the cognitive level, but going on at the neuronal level, that we see these interactions, that changes in the anterior cingulate cortex may be helping to explain some of the changes we're seeing in working memory and things of that nature. So a lot of our work going forward is really looking at how these systems interplay, effects of things like inflammation, and how all of this may be involved to result in these wonderful effects that we see from mindfulness meditation. So how does mindfulness help? Well, it appears that mindfulness may alter the impact of negative off-task thoughts so that task performance is not harmed on any sort of task you're doing. And that's obviously helpful in the lab, but probably really helpful at work, in conversations with significant others, or driving down the road so you're careful and don't kill anyone. So mindfulness, it's helpful. Your mind may be full, but being able to be focused on exactly what you need to focus on and letting all of those other thoughts pass through is helpful. So maybe keep calm and try to pay attention. And I want to end really quickly with a quote from one of my favorite philosophers of all time, one maybe you've heard of, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a wonderful quote in one of the more recent Star Wars movies, where he says, "Be mindful of your thoughts, Anakin. They betray you." And I'll leave you with this: try to not let your thoughts hijack your attention and betray your focus. Thank you very much.
Wow, wonderful job, Dr. Banks. That was really enlightening. This is a perfect time for anybody to ask any questions in regards to Dr. Banks' presentation. I do know I actually have quite a few myself, one of which, while people are kind of coming up with ideas for themselves on different questions, I know that you do a lot of the experimental psychology courses. I am kind of curious, is this a form of positive psychology, the testing that you've been utilizing, or what has been found from this could be utilized in that way?
Absolutely. So I don't know that I would necessarily look at it in terms of positive psychology. While there are obviously connections there with the mindfulness training and really the mindfulness training literature, it's not necessarily about looking at positive things. It's about being aware of your current thoughts, right? So it's about being aware of your current thoughts and what might be going on, and your ability to focus your attention on whatever task it is, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be a positive thought, but really focus your task on, say, driving, or focusing in class, or focusing while you work. So there are relations to positive psychology, but that's not necessarily kind of where my work is. Gotcha.
Would mindfulness be in comparison or similar to wise mind when they do like the diabolical behavioral therapy?
So there are obviously some very important connections to clinical psychology with mindfulness meditation, and mindfulness has really been pulled in more recently, I believe, in more kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, and integrating components of mindfulness in there. I think one thing that's important, and I think that's wonderful and could be very helpful. I know that there's a literature out there looking at maybe some of the negative consequences to mind wandering, or I'm sorry, to mindfulness meditation. So, for example, if you're more focused on your thoughts and more aware of your thoughts, then at that point you may also be more aware of negative thoughts you're having, and that can be harmful for things like rumination and for some clinical aspects. So I think one thing that's important is that the mindfulness literature right now, we're still working at points to see exactly how mindfulness works, right? So I talked about a couple studies that we've done that are looking at some of the mechanisms. I think it's important really to identify the mechanisms and know when they're going to work best and with what populations they'll work best before we start really jumping too far into some of those clinical applications. If that helps answer your question.
Very nice. And it sounded like you actually answered Raphael's question there too. Yeah, he actually wrote, is rumination a potential mechanism for the reactivity toward negative thoughts?
Absolutely, that's a great comment, and so a lot of my work, as I've talked about mindfulness and I've talked about stress, really the thing that ties those two together is my focus on attentional control and failures of attentional control really being mind wandering, and so I think we can think about something like rumination as kind of an extreme negative form of mind wandering, where we're rather than just mind wandering about a lot of different topics, we really are mind wandering typically with rumination about maybe a specific event or a specific type of event or class of events. So rumination isn't necessarily the same, but I think it does fall under the maybe a broader umbrella that we can think of as negative off-task thoughts.
Very good. Okay. Well, do you have any recommendations for a mindfulness app for the phone?
So I've tried a couple myself. I'm always hesitant to recommend one product over another. My recommendation is to find one that really you like, that works well and that you can follow. There's some mindfulness training out there on YouTube and places like that don't work as well for me, and that don't necessarily help me focus my attention. I've tried a couple. I think I saw a piece of data the other day saying that there were two out there that were quite popular. Insight Timer and Headspace, I think, were the two. But there are lots out there. Really, just kind of what works best for you. And of course, mindfulness-based stress reduction training classes are really the best way to go about it because those are 8-week trainings that really teach you how to meditate and teach you the skills in the mindfulness-based stress reduction that we talked about today. And then oftentimes people find that they can go on and they don't end up using apps or things of that nature after they've received that kind of full official training.
Yeah, because as we all know, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? I mean, if you're not continuously training yourself, then you're not going to remember or how to use it or use it in everyday life.
And the literature on mindfulness is really showing that exact same thing, that if you only use it a little bit, it's not going to be all that helpful. You can think about, I make the analogy of people who only go out and work out on the weekends, right? And they go out and work out on the weekends and they work very hard and they end up injuring themselves because they're not really in great shape because they're not doing it frequently enough. They're not getting the exercise they need. And that's at least what one of the Jaw et al. Studies really showed, is that those that are only doing a little bit actually seem to be worse off than those that are doing it consistently.
Very interesting. Now, with the Master of Science in Experimental Psychology, I mean, that program allows you to find the answers to questions that the students may be interested in, right?
Absolutely. So the way the program's run is we really run a program a little more similar to kind of the start of a PhD program, in that we have a small cohort that comes in, and students are matched up really relatively quickly, within a month or so, with faculty mentors. And different faculty mentors handle it differently. So for instance, for myself, if a student is interested in working memory or mind wandering, attentional control, mindfulness, then I'm the perfect person to work with. But if someone's interested in looking at something with social psychology, I'm not that person, right? So we all have different areas of expertise, and we really do a lot to help to match students with those areas and help them find a faculty member that can work to shape the ideas that they may have into a testable hypothesis in a study that we can feasibly do within the time frame of the program.
I think that's the most exciting thing, is being able to finally answer questions that you yourself have. You know, just that factor alone.
Yeah, and Alex SROUR was the master student that spawned my interest in mindfulness, and she came in because she was a yoga instructor, and so this was something that personally mattered to her, and so she was interested in kind of some of the effects, and she was interested in looking at the cognitive effects with them as well. So.
Raphael has another question. In terms of frequency, duration, etc., how would you describe the training that experiment participants underwent? And are there any follow-up studies planned to see how they persisted using the training?
Absolutely. So great questions. In terms of frequency, at least for the 1 week training study we did here, we did ask them how often they were engaging in the training, and participants, if I remember off the top of my head, were listening to it between 4 and 5 times during that week. And each of those, there were 15-minute recordings, so they were fixed. I think there are definitely follow-up studies that we would like to do to really manipulate that, to see if we can find other methods of delivery. So I really do like the idea of trying to deliver something via an app, because it's something that students have on their phones, right? So they can do this relatively regularly, and we can prompt them to do it over the course of a couple weeks. We can vary the training as we go. In terms of seeing whether they persist after the training, at the moment, right now, I'm not looking at that. What I'm interested in is seeing kind of what the dose of the training really needs to be to find some of these effects, and then really looking at trying to identify the mechanisms. It would be very interesting to see some of the longer lasting effects. So if people do a month-long training in the fall semester, there are reasons to believe that maybe we would see improvements in cognitive functions that might persist a semester later. And so something like that would be an interesting study to conduct. Some of those get to be a little harder, especially for a master's thesis, simply because of the time that master's students have to complete their work. Our program is a 2-year program, and so at least most faculty tend to be pretty mindful in the fact that you have a limited period of time to collect your data, and we want you to be successfully complete the program in that 2 years.
Do you guys happen to look at the age gaps, like an older individual versus younger individuals too?
So all of the work in my lab is really looking at younger adults, looking at college students. There obviously could be some interest in looking at older adults and looking at mindfulness training there. I would like to look at mindfulness training in other high stress populations and see what's going on. And there we would really be moving outside of
I think I lost him there. There you are. We lost you for a second there.
Oh, sorry.
Well, you mentioned high stress environments. Have you talked to some of the faculty that might work with first-time responders?
So I have, and I've been working with some colleagues that have access to populations that work with first responders, mainly because it's helpful to tailor some of those trainings to those groups. That often with mindfulness training, people's first reaction to mindfulness is, oh, well, it's for hippies or it's for Buddhist monks. And so there are ways to tailor some of those trainings so that they work a little bit better for certain groups. And so I've been working with some colleagues that do mindfulness research and have access to those populations to start some of those avenues.
That would be extremely interesting. If there's no other questions, I want to remind everybody that this session has been recorded. It will be on our website. Our website is nova.edu/DRA for the Department of Recruitment and Admissions under the archives. Of course, our information's there on Dr. Banks's page. Feel free and email us or give us a call. We're always here for students. If you're interested in the experimental psychology program or even our general psychology program, please reach out, feel free. We are here for you. We want to make sure that you're put into the right program because it is an investment in yourself. I hope everybody did enjoy themselves. Thank you again, Dr. Banks. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.